In today's video, we're taking a look at all the NHL trade and free agent rumors from around the NHL. We're looking at teams like the Vancouver Canucks, the Winnipeg Jets, the Colorado Avalanche, and the Chicago Blackhawks. We'll jump into all the latest news coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, we have a variety of news and rumors to talk about here today. From around the league, I want to kick things off with the latest on the Colorado Avalanche. Now, of course, the Avalanche also renamed their arena this past week as well. They're no longer going to be called the Pepsi Center. It is now going to be called Ball Arena after a new partnership was announced with the Ball Corporation. Now, overall, I think Joe Sakic and the Avalanche have had a pretty solid offseason, but the latest reports indicate that they may not be done yet. They'd like to add another defenseman and probably another third or fourth line winger, someone who can add some experience and some grit, some sandpaper in that bottom six for them. Right now, they do have a little bit of salary cap space remaining, just a tad under $6 million. They still have to sign the newly acquired Devon Toews, who they picked up from the New York Islanders. Based on what I'm hearing, I think his contract's probably going to end up somewhere around $2.5 million on a shorter-term contract. Likely is what's going to happen. So they're still going to have enough space to add one or two depth pieces, so you can get somebody, around league minimum or between $700,000 to $1 million. If you look around through free agency, though, there's really not a lot left out there. I mean, there are still some decent players that are looking for deals, but based on what they're looking for, I would think there's probably a couple of defensemen that would make sense for them, which would either be Sami Vatanen or maybe Slater Koekkoek. I mean, Koekkoek is a player who likely would be a little bit cheaper. Could be a bottom pair guy or a 6-7 type of player. Certainly had a decent run with Chicago here most recently, so he could be a player that might show of interest. I mean, when it comes to Vatanen, he certainly would likely command a little bit more money, a little bit more established defenseman. There's certainly a variety of teams that are rumored to be interested in him. If you look at the Avs blue line right now, I mean, obviously they have some young dynamic defensemen, obviously like Cale Makar, Samuel Girard. They just added Devon Toews. You have some veterans like Ian Cole, Erik Johnson. Adding another defenseman back there for some extra added depth would probably be a wise move. You can never have too many defensemen. They do have some younger D as well, like a Connor Timmins or a Bowen Byram. You have to wonder what their status will be for the coming season and how much action they will see. But obviously a common strategy is not to have too many young defensemen have too much ice time here all at one time, and already having a lot of youth in there between Girard and Makar. Obviously you need to have some experience back there so you're well balanced. So we'll have to see who they target. We could end up seeing the Avalanche go to the route of a trade, but right now I would think that they're probably looking mostly at free agents. When it comes to forwards, there's certainly some high-profile forwards out there still looking for deals, but there's still a decent amount of players out there who could certainly fill a bottom six role and be a sandpaper type of player. So look out for the Avalanche. They're not likely done. Adding a couple of extra players here just for some extra added depth and sandpaper before they kind of wrap up their offseason. Now, the latest on the Vancouver Canucks. We've talked about the possibility of them being interested before in a player like Mike Hoffman, but right now there is talk that they're still very interested in having negotiations to bring back forward Josh Leivo. Of course, Leivo missed a lot of time last year, is a current unrestricted free agent who's looking for a home like Hoffman and others. Of course, he had a pretty decent run in Vancouver when he was healthy, and they could go that route rather than go down a more expensive route like on a guy like Hoffman or Anthony Duclair or Granlund or these other players that are a little bit more higher profile out there on the free agent market. Now, the Vancouver Canucks are pretty tight with the cap space right now, but they will be getting a new buyout window here this weekend after their last RFA contract was completed. So obviously Jake Virtanen signed, and he signed a little less than many thought. He ended up closer to $2.5 million, where many thought it'd be closer to $3 million. So there's about $400,000 or $500,000 extra there that they were able to save, which worked out quite well. I must say that Virtanen contract is relatively fair and certainly, like I said, cheaper than I was expecting. But bringing back Josh Leivo might make a little bit more sense, more economically at least, rather than trying to dip in and obviously replace a player like Tyler Toffoli is what their intention was. But, you have to wonder if Leivo had been healthy and performing at a higher level that they were expecting when they acquired him from Toronto, that maybe they wouldn't have gone the route of adding an extra scorer at the deadline. It could have certainly changed the whole schematics for the team. So obviously bringing him back on a cheaper contract might be easier. Now when it comes to that buyout window, Like I mentioned before, Louis Eriksson, don't expect him to be going anywhere. That contract's pretty much buyout proof, at least for this year. They'd only save about $300,000. That is not going to be happening. The most likely candidate, based on contract, would be Brandon Sutter. He's got 1 year left, over $4 million. That would make the most sense for them to free up some space. They can vary contracts like Eriksson or Bearcheat in the minors, get a little bit of extra cap relief that way as well. So if they bury a couple of contracts in the minors, like I mentioned, that could give them upwards of $1 million each in relief. And then buying out Sutter could get a few more $1 million in cap relief. They can bring back a guy like Josh Levo and still have some flexibility there. So could they continue to dip into free agency? It's possible, but not really all that likely. The Canucks had also been looking at some other defensemen in free agency before the Nate Schmidt trade was completed, but their back end and goaltending situations are certainly, completely ready here for next season. Now, the latest on the Winnipeg Jets is they might be looking at adding a veteran defenseman, Travis Hamonic, and there appears to be mutual interest on both sides. Of course, Hamonic is one of the few remaining veteran defensemen out there with a good amount of experience on the open market still. It's been believed here that Hamonic has received a fair bit of interest from a number of Eastern Conference teams, but he would prefer to stay west due to family reasons. Obviously, between Alberta and Manitoba would likely be his preferred destinations. At this point, I don't think it's quite likely he returns to Calgary, although I wouldn't completely rule that out at this point, but it seems to be less likely as time goes on. But obviously, it would be a good fit between himself and the Jets from a variety of standpoints. But obviously, they could get him signed here on a shorter-term contract for a decent amount of money and help fill some holes here on the blue line while they find a longer-term solution would be wise. But obviously, the Winnipeg Jets have been linked to a lot of other trade talk, mostly around Patrick Laine, that we've talked about here a lot in the last week or so. We don't have any additional information on those negotiations or how things are going on that front right now, but adding a guy like Hamonic on the back end makes a lot of sense. It just seems like there's waiting for a lot of other RFAs and other things to be resolved here before he signs, but he's certainly weighing out his options, and Winnipeg seems like a pretty likely destination at this point. And of course, the Chicago Blackhawks are a team we talked about a few days ago about the potential to see some massive moves on their veteran core players like Taves, Kane, and Duncan Keith, mostly due to the fact that the Blackhawks have come forward here with their fans in the form of a letter indicating that they're bracing a full rebuild. So obviously you need to have some veterans around, but when you have that kind of money tied up in those kind of players, it certainly raises a lot of question marks on their future. So we went through and take a look at all those players, what their options could be, and talk about the possibilities. Now, we do have comments from GM Stan Bowman at this point who confirms that the Hawks are not going to be going to those players and asking them to waive their no trades in order to move to another franchise. And we also have words to different media interviews. At this point, it doesn't sound like at least that any of them are going to request that Chicago trade them either. So they very well could stick it around at least for a little while longer. You'd have to think, though, between Taves and Kane making a cap hit of $10.5 million, you've got Duncan Keith about $5.5 million. But based on the contracts, I would think that out of the three, the most likely to go would be Keith based on contract. You'd have to think, though, that based on talent and intrigue to acquire, that Kane would get the most interest should they start to explore moving any of these veterans. If you take a look at the contracts, though, Duncan Keith's contract's pretty backdiving, meaning that his salary is slowly decreasing each and every year. So, for example, he's got 3 years left. He goes from a $2.6 million salary to a $2.1 million salary, then down to 1.5. So even though his cap hit is much higher at 5.5, his actual dollars out are much lower. So that becomes a pretty attractive contract to a team who would like to have the player, is not overly concerned about the space, but obviously likes the fact they can get away with paying them a much lower amount. I can't help but wonder if maybe next year, if the Hawks would go to Duncan Keith and ask him to waive his no move to be available in the expansion draft for Seattle to consider. I mean, for Seattle to add a veteran player like him with all that experience, that kind of a low salary could be very intriguing for them. And of course, we saw with what Vegas did last year, they ended up with more than enough players, and to be active in free agency and trades throughout the offseason, they could, obviously take 30 players from the expansion draft. Doesn't mean they're going to keep them all. They're going to end up with way too many players at different positions. They're going to make some trades, and then they're going to obviously acquire other assets, go through free agency, the draft, etc. So, even if they considered flipping him, that's another possibility. But you'd have to think that Chicago could go to Keith about that and be possible. If not, you'd have to think a contending team would be interested in his services. It's just a matter of making the cap hit work. And if Chicago can retain some money to bring that down, that would be a pretty intriguing asset for teams to acquire. that are trying to make that final push and trying to add some extra experience here. I know he's not quite the defenseman he used to be, but in my opinion, he's still a pretty good skater and still has all that valuable experience, which could certainly be a big help to a team who might have a lot of youth and a lot of skill and are looking for some of that experience to go, kind of over the top and add a different element to their team, kind of like what we've seen the Maple Leafs do. Of course, we'll see how they make out, but they've certainly changed their team dynamic by adding a lot more experience to their lineup by bringing in guys like Joe Thornton and Wayne Simmons and keeping Jason Spezza around for another season here as well. So at this point, it's unlikely that we see any major moves, at least in a very, very short term, out of the Chicago core players. But longer term, it's certainly, I think anything is quite possible. And Duncan Keith, in my opinion, is the most likely to move with that kind of contract between the expansion draft and teams looking to make an acquisition for a cup run. You'd have to think that's pretty attractive. Now, based on recent comments from GM Stan Bowman, it also makes it sound like the Chicago Blackhawks are not completely done with their current offseason moves as well. Even though they won't be going to these players and requesting them to waive their no-move clauses, it doesn't mean that they're not going to be doing other things. Bowman's indicated here that obviously they're working on a new contract for Dylan Strome. That's in the early stages, and they're hoping to get that done sometime in relatively soon here. And once that's completed, he indicated that they very well could be in the market for a potential trade or two. He feels teams are having a lot of conversations around the trades, and as free agency kind of slows down here a little bit further, once we get a few more of these UFAs and RFAs off the market, that teams are going to start trading a little bit more, and there's a lot more conversations taking place. I think part of what slowed the trade market down is that there's still a lot of RFAs out there and some UFAs unsigned, and teams are trying to get an idea what they're doing with that before they can really dive a little bit deeper here into their longer-term cap projections when it comes to making trades. So do we think that... So it looks like the Hawks could still continue to be a little bit busy. You'd have to think players like Zach Smith or Calvin DeHaan would be the most likely players they'd be looking to move out. But it's hard to say what kind of market there would be for those types of players. And obviously they're going to have some more question marks on their LTIR when it comes to guys like Shaw and Seabrook. Will they be able to play this year? If they're on long-term injury reserve and the Hawks have a little bit more cap flexibility, maybe we could see a scenario where the Hawks could take on a bad contract in order to get some extra assets as well, so to kind of help with the rebuild to gain some future prospects there. So we'll see what happens, but the Hawks very well could continue to be busy before the offseason is over. So that is all your latest updates for today. So let me know your thoughts and opinions and everything discussed down below in the comments, and we'll discuss further. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content, and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.